Hello and welcome to the Grant Fundamentals training for the Nevada State Grant Office. This will be the first in a series of trainings, but this is going to give you a foundational understanding of what grant funds do, how they should be used responsibly, and where to look for resources if you have any questions. We know a lot of people working in programs have been handed a grant and it's here you go, you get to monitor this now, and so this is going to give you a solid foundation of help that is available and how to manage a grant properly. So a little bit about the Nevada State Grant Office. My name is Erin Hasty. I'm an executive grant analyst, and I will be putting together a training portfolio, so I'd love to hear from you additional trainings that you'd like to see or other topics that you have questions on or what you see as missing from your office. But about us is we are known officially as the Office of Grant Procurement Coordination and Management. We provide services to state agencies, local governments, and nonprofit organizations at no charge. Most of what we do is on the pre-award side, so starting up in grant applications, but we're also available to answer any questions about best practices at any point, either in the application, post-award, or closeout of the grant. We research and answer questions on best practices, so if at any point you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're connected with an array of grant professionals, and so we are happy to research on any questions that you have, whether it be on indirect costs, how to write a grant, or anything in between. So some services that we provide is we distribute federal funding opportunities. If you've ever looked at grants.gov or any of the listservs, they can be very overwhelming. And so we'll curate funding opportunities and send out at least once a month, sometimes more, on 13 specific topics. So if you go to our website, which will be shown at the end of the slideshow, you can sign up for funding opportunities by topic, such as workforce development, education, higher education, natural resources. Sign up, and then we will send you at least once a month current funding opportunities. If you have any questions or would like more information about those funding opportunities, we're also able to take a deeper dive and to let you know specifics and what the grant requires. We'll also provide project management for grant applications. A lot of the times people writing grants have full-time jobs, and so being put on a grant is in addition to your full-time work. The grant office will project manage and hold weekly meetings, hold deadlines, make deadlines so that the grant application is moving towards completion, and we'll be the ones who will follow up and then let people know if you are falling behind or if more information is needed. So we can really be the project driver to make sure that the grant application is moving forward according to plan. We also have a database, and we hear from statewide partners, and so we'll identify potential grant partners. If there's an education grant and we know of other local partners who are looking towards the same opportunities that you are, we'll connect you. Part of what makes a strong application is aligned services, and statewide grant applications make for stronger opportunities. So if we're aware of anybody who's working on the same goals as you, we will connect you with them. We also, if you're looking for a specific grant opportunity that's not out yet, you can let us know, and then we'll track it. And then if there are any opportunities in the future that we see, we'll reach out to you and let you know that those have become aware. We also provide technical assistance and training on federal and state grant mandates. A lot of times new policies come out or we hear about something, and so we will let you know best practices or if there's any new guidance that comes out. Okay, and then grant office resources. Part of this training is really to make this an intuitive feel for you. We can't teach you everything in a crash course about what grants are for, and we are constantly learning as well. But what I wanted to do in creating this training was to at least give you areas of where you can begin to look. Of course, you can always contact us, but these provide some really good resources for you when no one is available, or if you're in a pinch, or just to start to get to know the feel of grants. So the grant office website, we have a Nevada grant manual and grant process templates. This helps tell you what is required for your state agency to have, and then some best practices on how to get there. Of course, we're always available for questions if you have anything or need additional information. The grant manual is a good place to turn to learn about what is required in Nevada. We also have some grant process templates, including a decision matrix if you're thinking about whether a grant is a good fit for you or whether to put in the energy of whether to apply or not. We have some tools there that will help you decide that. We have pre-award process, we have post-award, and then we have best practices for managing the award. So you'll find those on our grant office website. There's a grant matching fund program that is getting ready to launch in January of 2020. It's a pilot project that has $1 million for grant match funds. We heard that a lot of people weren't able to apply for grants because they didn't have grant match. And so this is a pot of money that you'll fill out an application for, and it's reviewed by a team of reviewers. But if you cannot find grant match funds, then this program gives you resources, and you can apply to get the match from there. We also have a grant management system that is in the works. This will track and highlight grants throughout the state of Nevada. We have the Nevada Advisory Council on Federal Assistance. They are tasked with maximizing and optimizing grant funds into Nevada. There's legislators that serve on there, as well as nonprofits and business. The grant office provides staffing support to it, but they're really looking at a lot of policy and barriers and how to bring in more federal grant dollars to Nevada. And so if you're interested in attending any of those hearings or meetings, sign up and let us know. They through their recommendations, we received legislation for the grant matching fund and the grant management system. And they're always interested in hearing from nonprofits, local governments, and state agencies on barriers that they face as grant professionals, whether that's in applying or having issues administering them. We also have the Funding Opportunities Listserv, which I mentioned earlier. We curate and send out topic-specific grant opportunities. We serve as a single point of contact, or SPOC. You may have seen Intergovernmental Review or Executive Order 12372. Our office is the SPOC, so if you ever see that in the future, just know that you need to contact us. The purpose of that was to create aligned grant applications. So if you let our office know, we prefer that you let us know when you're applying for it before you submit the application. So if you're applying for a grant opportunity and we know other people are applying for a grant opportunity, we look to align the applications. So if you can work together, one single application is stronger than another. And so if you see the SPOC or single point of contact, then you need to contact our office and let us know that you're applying for the grant. We also host viewings of NGMA trainings and other trainings that we're subscribers for. A lot of the grant professional organizations put together subrecipient monitoring and very topic-specific trainings that deal with audits or just very specific matter. And since we subscribe, we can host viewings. So we will be sharing those as we get those, and that's a good way to learn more content-specific ways. We also have a state grant work group, which that's where we post a lot of the trainings that we see. And so if you are a grant professional and you'd like to have resource of state agencies, then let us know. And the state grant work group is set up in Microsoft Teams. We contact to a lot of grant professionals. We ask for their advice, or we let them know best practices or anything we hear. And so it's just a really nice way to be connected with other grant professionals across state agencies and to hear from the grant office. Or if you guys have questions from each other, then you can post it on there, and it's just a really nice learning lab. So if you're interested in becoming part of the state grant work group and you work in grants, just let us know and we will sign you up. Okay, so the training objectives for today, again, this is to make grants intuitive for you. If we shared everything that was required for grants, there's no way we could do this in an hour. And so this is to make it intuitive and to just alert you, to give you enough knowledge to be alerted if something doesn't seem right, or if you need to look into further information. So today you will learn a high-level overview of grants, learn how to think critically about what a grant award can and should do, and learn how to be a good steward of grant dollars. And so this is important because grant dollars, at its very essence, they provide services. And so if funds aren't being properly managed or properly written for, then it's not just that you get an audit finding and you get in trouble that way, but what it can really mean is services lost for other people. So you're being awarded something, and that means it's taking away from other people. And if funds aren't managed properly, then that can mean that somebody is not getting opioid treatment, or a child isn't getting preschool, all-day preschool, because grant dollars really are a way to provide really important services to people. And so when you're managing them, you're responsible for making sure that the dollars go to what they're supposed to. And again, when you're in the thick of it, it can seem just like pushing paper. But what grants do is they can provide really important services, and they can make a difference in someone's life. And when they're not being managed properly, that can be taking away from that. To get started, we'll do a quiz. So think about these. Anyone can get a grant. Grants can pay for anything and everything. And grants are money with no strings attached. Okay, true or false? Anyone can get a grant. That's false. Grants have eligibility requirements. They're highly competitive, and many proposals don't get funded. Our office is frequently contacted by people looking for personal loans or business loans. And the truth is that if you've ever seen a notice of funding opportunity, there are very specific requirements. And you really have to make sure that you're reading it and that you're eligible. Additionally, many grant proposals don't get funded. Our office is contacted by a lot of people who think that because they've created something that they're going to get funded automatically. And a lot of the federal funding opportunities we've seen are very competitive. I worked on a grant before that 8 were awarded, and there were over 200 submissions. We've had partners who have applied for grants 7 times and been awarded on the 7th time. So it's very competitive. There's eligibility requirements, and it's not an automatic that you'll get funded. Okay, true or false? Grants can pay for anything and everything. That's false. Most are very specific about covered expenses. So we also get people reaching out to our office looking for paid vacations and things like that. And as you've known, if you've ever run a grant, you have to be very careful that you are operating within your grant agreement, because it specifically calls out what it's allowed for and what it's not. Okay, and true or false? Grants are money with no strings attached. That's false. Your agency, if you're awarded, is managing a promise, and grants have strings. So again, you're signing a contract essentially. When you're awarded the money, you are given parameters. It's like when you take a loan for your mortgage, you have to operate and pay on time, and there are certain things you can't do. It's the same with the grant. When you write the application, you're telling them what they're going to do. When you're accepting the funds, you're telling them that you will operate in those parameters, and they will be checking to make sure that you are doing those. Okay, so what a grant can do. A grant is a form of financial assistance, and while there are many different types of grants, what we're going to be talking about today is federal financial assistance, which is defined as a transfer of value, most often money, from a federal agency to a non-federal agency. So very simple, it's a transfer of money. It's designed to be a tool to serve public purposes defined by the funder, and they mostly solve social issues. So this is going to be dealing with federal funding, but I'll also talk about state funding as well, because the state funds and is responsible for overseeing subrecipients. And so in order to ensure that you're being a good steward of grant dollars, you need to be sure that you're doing risk assessments and that you're properly managing funds. And then you also need to be sure that you are operating in your parameters. Okay, so what a grant can do, of the federal funding, there are two categories that are described as discretionary and mandatory. So most funding is mandatory, and it's determined outside of the appropriations process. So Congress is given authority to spend funds, so they will set the appropriations, and then in a mandatory program, it's really limited. Like the regulations are limited to what it can be served for. Discretionary grants are competitive, and so Congress will set funds there, and then it really gives some leeway to the funding agency, the federal agency, to determine how those funds will be used. So if you look at this graph, the distribution of grants, out of the 209 programs, the mandatory or formula programs were only 47. However, if you follow the green, they accounted for $492 billion, or 76% of what the dollars went for. So while there is a smaller amount of programs, the funding for those are quite higher. We'll go into mandatory a little later, but really what that is like SNAP or Medicaid. Okay, and then if you look at the blue, so there were more discretionary grants, the number 162, or 78% of what was allocated by Congress in FY 2017, but only 153 billion, or 24%, was given out were those. So while there are more competitive programs, the funding is lower. As you saw in the previous slide, the highest number of grant opportunities are discretionary. And discretionary grants are competitive, which means that they go through a competitive scoring process. The most common way that these are distributed is a call for application will be issued through a notice of funding opportunity. So an agency will put out application requirements and scoring requirements in an application, and those who are interested will fill out the application to apply and compete to receive the discretionary grant. Okay, so how the discretionary grants are awarded is an application review is done. The applications are scored on established criteria, and generally the highest scored applications are recommended for funding. And again, this is when Congress sets it up and gives the federal awarding agency leeway in how to appropriate the funds. Some examples of state of Nevada discretionary grants is the Nevada Ready Pre-K grant. So it was given $43 million over 4 years to increase Nevada's preschool population. This was designed to give low-income children opportunities to enter into all-day preschool. So then that's what was originally happening, and then you see how because of the federal grant, then it was able to become part of state policy. So in the 80th legislative session, SB 84 outlined program requirements for now state-funded preschool programs. So you see again when I said earlier how the proper managing of funding can affect people. You see that by using this grant, this gives 4-year-olds under 200% federal poverty level the opportunity to attend all-day preschool. And then why is that important? Because data has shown that improved health, lifetime earnings, reduction in the need for special education and remediation, and lower dropout rates have happened, among many other things. So this federal grant has given many opportunities to people in the state. Another discretionary grant example is the Gear Up program, which connects low-income, underrepresented students to post-secondary opportunities in Nevada institutions. So they received $24 million for 7 years, and then the grant itself required some match funds. So it was a $24 million match, so $48 million total were given to provide post-secondary opportunities to low-income students. And so some outcomes for that were Gear Up students consistently exceeded the high school graduation rate. And again, you see how these grant dollars really go to important opportunities for Nevadans. Okay, so mandatory grants are also known as formula. Congress they just fund, and then the the federal agency itself is not given that much authority on how the funds are to be allocated. However, they do have sanction authority, and they can reduce the amount, or no award can still happen. So if you're not properly managing your prior formula funds, the agency can decide not to fund you. There's 2 types of non-discretionary and mandatory assistance called block grants and entitlement programs. Okay, so block grants are formula-driven grants where the awardee is responsible to further distribute money. A lot of agencies at the state have this, so they get the money and then they are inclined and mandated to pass through to local governments. So some examples include HUD's Development Community Block Grant, Department of Health and Human Services Child Care and Development Block Grant, and the Department of Labor's Workforce and Investment Act. Okay, so the block grant is WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It becomes law in 2014. The state is given some money, and then they are charged with distributing it to local governments. So the state, Nevada DETR, Department of Employment Training and Rehabilitation, gets awarded money from the Department of Labor, and then they're responsible for passing that through to local governments in order to take care and meet the bulleted mandates required by WIOA. So an example of a block grant seen in a local community, and remember a lot of the formulas funding requires a prime awardee, generally the state, to push out dollars to local communities and people who are able to implement services in the community from the local perspective. So for WIOA in Southern Nevada,
The local board is called Workforce Connections, and they are tasked with seeking job seekers to education, job training, and employment opportunities. They are taking what is required in the WIOA Act and implementing it in the communities. So you'll see in Southern Nevada, those who are eligible are 412,000 adults and 90,000 youth. There are 35 neighborhoods that have double-digit unemployment. And then you have $120 million in annual funding across their one-stop partners, which is where all of these organizations and funding streams reside in an effort to streamline services for those who are eligible, to make it easier for participants to receive funding. Some examples include housing, temporary assistance for needy families, the Job Corps, unemployment, etc. So a participant can come to this one-stop location and receive services and check eligibility from multiple funding streams. So you see this is where a braided funding platform comes from. And then you see the large number of people who are eligible for receiving services. So proper management of these funds is essential, and they are doing incredibly important work in helping those who need it to receive job support, employment support, and to get on their feet. So the proper management and to continue to serve the WIOA charter so that the state can continue to receive funds from the federal agency is imperative.
Okay, there's also, as part of the mandatory and formula grants, is what's known as entitlement grants. So the federal government is legally obligated to make grants to states for a person who meet the criteria for eligibility. So some examples include the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, federal unemployment, and then the Medicaid program. So if a person meets an eligibility requirement, then by law they are required to get the services, and then the state oversees those funds. An example includes Medicaid. So in Nevada, Medicaid provides health care for those at or below 133% of poverty. And then there's another portion of that, the Nevada Checkup or CHIP, which provides healthcare benefits for uninsured children, for low-income families who are not eligible for Medicaid, but who are at 200% below the federal poverty level. And if you'll notice, the 200% federal poverty level, that was also what was in the preschool grant for children who were able to be eligible for all-day preschool. So you see this blending and braiding of data so that we're providing services for the same population, with healthcare and also with education.
So to see what a large impact formula funding has in Nevada, in 2019 of August, 666,000 people were enrolled in Medicaid and CHIP. So that's 20% of the total Nevada population receiving services from Medicaid. In state fiscal year 2014, nearly $2 billion was used and spent in Medicaid. So you see that formula funding has a very large dollar amount that is used in Nevada, and also can provide services to a lot of its population.
Okay, so now you've seen what some grants can do, and you've seen the services that some discretionary and mandatory programs have given, and now you're going to see how they're regulated and governed. And so, like we just saw with Medicaid, nearly $2 billion was given in 1 year. And so there has to be proper management of that. And there are both federal and state requirements in how to do that. So at the level, grants are governed by levels of law, and disputes are resolved by the order of precedence. So you'll see here that there are levels, and if there are any questions, it goes in that order of precedence. So the very top echelon is the Constitution. No grant opportunity or funding opportunity can violate anything in the Constitution. Then there's the applicable laws in states of the United States, so including mandated statutory authority. And then it goes to regulations, and then award-specific terms and conditions, and then other documents and attachments. So when you get a notice of funding opportunity and you're awarded that, you'll look and see what is required in your funding opportunity. So you're beholden to those. And then if you know that, then you're also beholden to this Code of Federal Regulations. So you can't violate any of these things. Then other laws and what Congress mandated and the Constitution. So you always have to be sure that you're following all of the order, and that you know what's in them and that you're not violating any of them. Okay, so this gives you an overview of how this works. So a new law is added to the books, and so we'll look at some examples. So Congress appropriates funds to federal agencies and passes other grant-related legislation. So that's the top of the legal hierarchy. That's the statute and regulation. An example of that is in 2014, Congress passed the Data Act, making all federal award data accessible to the public on a single website. So Congress mandated this, but this doesn't really give state workers or federal workers any idea of how to do this and how to spend the money. Okay, so then in order to give guidance, an executive order and a memorandum is issued. So the Executive Office of the President issues guidance for implementing the legislation. So then in 2015, an example of that is the Executive Office of the President created a task force and launched a pilot program to determine how the Data Act would be implemented. So then after that task force launched, they created some recommendations to give to agencies, federal agencies, which resulted in administrative policies and procedures. Okay, so then that's step number 3. The grant-making agency developed administrative policies based on the guidance of that task force. So then the federal agencies adjusted their internal and external policies to the final guidance issued by the Executive Office of the President. So then if any funds were available from the federal agencies, they would create a notice of funding opportunity to the states and then write specifically what the grant parameters were, and then the states would write an application to that following the notice of funding opportunity, but then also making sure that it followed the regulations and then the executive order. An administration of a grant can be more restrictive, but never less. So if the state of Nevada wanted to introduce anything more granular, it could, but it couldn't undo or do anything differently that was less restrictive than any of the federal regulations.
In 2014, 2 CFR 200 or uniform guidance was put together from the Office of Management and Budget to create uniform requirements that grants for application and costs and management needed to follow. So all federal agencies follow these, and therefore their recipients and their awardees need to make sure that their programs follow these requirements. There are a lot of details in them, and I recommend that you always look through these, especially if you're administering grants, because as you saw previously in the hierarchy, management of grants needs to follow these guidance, and you cannot violate them. If you do, then you are at risk for findings, debarment, or any kind of penalties. Again, they're very lengthy and have a lot of detail, but to kind of look at it intuitively, the cost when you're building a grant or when you're trying to manage a subrecipient, you need to make sure that costs are reasonable and necessary, allocable, in conformance, and consistent.
Okay, so again, to have a strong program that can affect the most good and to follow requirements, you need to think of project design and maximizing the funds. So get that repetition in your head. To help with this, when you're either creating or overseeing a program, so if you're responsible for subrecipient monitoring or you're responsible for designing the program to spend the funds, you need to think reasonable and necessary, allocable, conformance, consistent, and documented.
So the first thing that a cost needs to be is reasonable and necessary. So this is for you if you are writing a grant or if you're monitoring somebody and they're submitting costs to you. You need to be sure that you're asking from a federal agency for something reasonable, and you need to make sure that when people are asking to be reimbursed from you, that the cost is reasonable. So essentially what that means is it's a prudent person test. So it's reasonable and necessary if a prudent person would find it so. More specifically, if you're looking at it, the cost is necessary for the organization to fulfill the grant's performance. So the costs have to be specific to the grant. If it's for opioid treatment and you're asking for a new copier, you need to show how that cost for the copier is going to meet the fulfillment of the grant for opioid treatment. The cost is reasonable and necessary if the recipient complied with its established organizational policies. So did it follow its own procedure? Did it treat it the same as it would if it was its own money? And the individuals responsible for the expenditure acted with due prudence in carrying out the responsibilities. So again, they treated the money with respect and as they would as if it were their own.
Okay, so some examples. Is the cost reasonable or necessary? Okay, you've been given a $500,000 grant. Would these pass the prudent person test? Okay, so on a $500,000 grant, you've allocated $30,000 for travel. That does not pass the prudent person test. That seems very excessive for travel. It's quite a bit of your total grant budget. You would need to look at, if you saw this proposal coming before you, you would need to look and see what that travel is for, who's going, why is it so much, can it be, you know, if they're asking for 10 people to go for travel, then can one person go and send that back and disseminate that information to people? Or would it be cheaper to fly somebody out to give the trainings to all your staff? So justifying $30,000 for travel on a $500,000 grant does not sound very reasonable. Okay, so on your $500,000 grant, you've allocated $30,000 for topic-specific trainings to workers who will be out in the field. Is that reasonable or necessary? Okay, so this would require further digging into. You need to find out what is the grant for, because that's still a pretty high percentage of your grant dollars. What is the purpose of the grant? Can the objectives of the grant be met without the training? So is this training necessary for you to meet the objectives? If the training is necessary, can it be done cheaper elsewhere? Are there any vendors or anybody who will provide the training for half of that? Or if you're sending people to the training, would it be cheaper to bring in somebody to do the training? Okay, so you really need to stop and think and probe if there's different ways to do this. Okay, so allocating $3,000 to attend a training in Washington, D.C. This again would require some further digging into to see if it's reasonable or not. What are you going to Washington, D.C. for? If it's for a grant, mandatory grant requirement, making sure that you're following the GSA rate, that you're staying at a hotel that honors the GSA. How many people are you sending? Does it have to be done in Washington, D.C.? So again, just thinking about, is this necessary to meet the objectives of the grant? Or can it be done differently? But if it's for a specific mandatory reason for the grant and you're following GSA, then it may be a reasonable cost. Okay, so subawarding funds to a nonprofit for the entire organization to have an in-person retreat. So this is where you need to look for and monitor what your sub-recipients are doing. If the entire organization is having an in-person retreat, you need to ensure and be sure that their retreat is only for meeting the objectives of the grant that you have. If it's for anything else, it is not reasonable or necessary. And you need to make sure that everybody who's attending this retreat is working on the grant. If they're not, then they're not helping meet the deliverables of the grant, and so the cost is not reasonable or necessary. Okay, is the cost reasonable or necessary if it's $200,000 for an executive director's salary in an area serving 60,000 residents? That is likely not reasonable or necessary. What you would need to do is look and see what comparable executive directors receive serving 60 areas with 60,000 residents. You need to look and see if you would want to spend nearly 50% of your grant dollars on salary. And you'd need to make sure that that money is going towards, like all of those dollars are going towards meeting the deliverables of the grant. Okay, we didn't use our money and the grant is due to expire. Can we spend it on a copier? So first, if you make any expenditures, you need to make sure that you put them in your application, that it's in your grant award, and that you're allowed to do that. You cannot expend money just because you need to spend it. It has to make sure that it's going towards grant deliverables, that the equipment is used for grant purposes. You would need to get permission from your federal project officer. You can't just spend it on something because you need to make an expenditure. And it might be nice to spend the money on that, but if the copier is for your office in general and maybe only 5% for the grant deliverables, then that is not reasonable and necessary. And your federal project officer is going to ask you to account for what those dollars are going for and what how the copier is necessary to you meeting those objectives for the grant deliverables. Okay, so the next thing to think of after reasonable and necessary is allocable. A cost is allocable if it's directly related to grant and is not excluded by the uniform guidance or other law. So again, knowing the uniform guidance is important. Costs are allowed if it's incurred solely in order to advance work under the grant. It benefits both the grant and other work of the organization, or it's necessary to the overall operation of the organization and is deemed to be assignable, at least in part, to the grant. So the cost definitely needs to be necessary to meeting the grant. Okay, so some examples. Is the cost allocable? Providing a luncheon for guests who attend a conference provided to showcase the grant. Okay, this is where it's really important to know the uniform guidance and your grant deliverables, because it's not always intuitive. So it might sound nice to be able to provide a luncheon for guests attending a conference that has everything to do with your grant. You're explaining to the grant what it's for, and you're getting people excited about it. But this is where the uniform guidance and other things like that come into play, because food is very rarely allowed. And so that's where you need to know about the uniform guidance and prohibitions by your federal agency. So even though it might sound intuitive and nice, it's not necessarily allocable. Okay, providing wage reimbursements to employers who hire a grant participant. This is where you need to look in your notice of funding opportunity and the parameters of the grant to see if it's allowed or not. It'll tell you if it's allowed or not. Sometimes there are, like a Department of Labor grant, you want to put workers who are hard to hire into manufacturing plants. Some opportunities will allow for some wage reimbursement to employers who hire them, and some will not. So in order to find out if the cost is allocable, you need to read the notice of funding opportunity. Okay, leasing a property for work related to the grant. Again, this is where you need to check and make sure that you are allowed to do that in your notice of funding opportunity. It's rare to be able to do that, but some allow for them and some don't. But then if you are leasing it or somebody is charging you as a subrecipient on what to lease, there are certain documents that need to be provided. For example, some health organizations require that the lease itself is provided, the design, and you need to show the office space, and then you need to show who is being charged to the grant and their workspace to show that it's not being charged, that you're not providing rent for the entire organization, but that the rent being charged is only for those who work there. So just because it's allowed, you also need to follow up with the proper documentation to make sure that you are properly documenting so you don't have any audit findings. Okay, providing cash incentives to participants to complete a survey. Okay, so this again is you need to look in the notice of funding opportunity to see what is allowed and what is not allowed. Sometimes you are allowed to provide participant stipends for people to complete data survey. Sometimes you can provide cash, sometimes you can provide gift cards, but what you always need to do is to be able to show that providing the incentives to participants is mandatory, otherwise they wouldn't get done without the incentives. So you're always responsible for proving that the dollars you're asking for and the activities you're asking for are necessary. You would have to show that the funds or the participants and the data would not be collected without providing these incentives. So the burden is on you to explain why you have to have cash incentives if it's allowed. Okay, advertisement for your organization. Advertisement is not allowed. The only things that you can do is you can advertise positions that are specific to the grant, and you can show certain events that are part of the grant, but advertising for organization is an unallowed cost. Okay, so we've had allocable, we've had reasonable and necessary, and the next big bucket to really think about to be a good steward of spending or monitoring grant funds is conformance and consistence. So costs and conformance of a grant if you do what the award tells you. So you're operating within the parameters of the grant, you're staying within that four corners of what you said you're going to do with that. And then a cost must be consistently applied. Again, it's with the, if your policy, your agency policy says that you have to do a want to get away from Southwest, and then you get a federal grant and you want to go on first class, that's not consistently applied. If you do operate without the conformance of the grant award, and sometimes you can talk to your federal project officer and get an exception, or you can request change to funds, you always need to get that in writing. Always make sure that you have it in writing because that's covering yourself. Okay, so examples are these policies in conformance, and are they consistent? An agency sub-awards to two different partners and both get reimbursed for personnel. One submits pay stubs and the other does not. That is not consistent. If you are reimbursing for personnel, you need to treat both agencies the same. And so you need to have a written policy on what you will accept and what you won't accept. And documentation is always the best. So I would always require some kind of pay stub or documentation for the reimbursement of personnel. Okay, an agency follows the procurement process to a vendor from the state general fund. The agency is then awarded federal funding and writes the name of the vendor they would like to work with the application. Because the federal award was approved with the name of the vendor in the proposal, the state agency skips the procurement process. That is not conformance or consistent. So you still have to follow your state procurement policy. Just because you were approved, the vendor you want to work with, and it's approved by the feds, does not mean that you can skip what your state requires. So if the vendor is required, even though you put in the name of vendor X in your grant application and it's approved, it doesn't mean that you can skip the procurement process from the state. You still have to follow it. Okay, an agency begins pre-work 30 days before the grant period begins and charges the federal agency for work done. Is that in conformance? It is not in conformance because it's not operating within the agreed contract. So your program date starts when it starts, and you cannot expend before or after that. You have to operate within what is specified in your contract. There are exceptions to pre-work. It's very rare, and you have to get written consent from the federal awarding agency. So if you do work prior to a grant period, do not expect to get reimbursed for it because it's not in your agreement. Okay, and the last is documented. When submitting expenditures, include backup documentation and require it for subrecipients. It's very important that either if you're expending things, that you're documenting how you're expending them. And then if you are monitoring subrecipients, you need to make sure that they are giving you documentation so that you can see that they're doing what they say they're doing. So you need to document many items, including but not limited to allowable or unallowable costs, equipment, grant match, level of effort, and procurement suspension and debarment. You know, an allowable or unallowable cost, if you're monitoring somebody or you're providing something, it would be a grant conference. You would need to show the invoice that you're not getting charged for food. So then you're covering yourself. Or you're making sure that a subrecipient isn't charging you for food, even if it's included in the banquet, even if it's included in the fee. You need to make sure. Okay, so if you had an equipment, like if you bought a generator, you would need to keep the receipt for that. Grant match, you would document the cash or in kind. If you have donated labor, you would need to track it. Same with the level of effort. You can have a template that shows the percentage of what a worker is working on. And then procurement, suspension, and debarment. If you are subgranting any federal funds to an agency, you need to make sure and you need to document that they're not suspended or debarred. You go to that to sam.gov, and then you need to save a screenshot to show to the federal agency that you're doing your due diligence, and that is a requirement that you need to check for your subrecipients that they have not been disbarred. You can get an audit finding for not proving that.
So obviously there are reporting requirements that as the prime awardee, you will need to be making regularly to your federal agency. And then if you're a subrecipient monitoring, you need to ensure that who you've designated money to is also reporting adequately back to you. There will be reporting requirements both programmatically and fiscally. So you need to be documenting and making sure that you're making progress on your grant deliverables, that you say that you're meeting the outcomes or that you're on track to meet the outcomes that you agreed to in your grant, and that you're properly expending. If you're overseeing subrecipients who you've given money to help you meet these deliverables, you need to be sure of the same thing, that they are on target and on track to help you meet the deliverables of the grant, and that they're adequately and properly expending resources. So some examples of these is quarterly reports. Some agencies require annual or more than quarterly. So you really need to check your notice of grant award, your contract there, to make sure that you're properly documenting and reporting on everything that you said you were. The minimum I've seen is quarterly reports, both on program and fiscal, but some grants require more intensive reporting, and some are monthly, some are you're working pretty hand in hand with a federal agency, and so you need to make sure that you are properly capturing the reporting requirements in your grant award and that you're following those. Some specific requirements is the FFATA, or the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. This is where on usaspending.gov, the federal government wanted to try and create a snapshot of where subrecipient dollars were going. And so if you subgrant more than $25,000 to an agency, you need to report that. For subrecipients, every subrecipient expending more than $750,000 per fiscal year in combined federal awards. So even if they're getting $100,000 from you, you need to see if they are making more than $750,000 per fiscal year in other federal awards. And they have to have a single audit requirement annually. And they need to be submitting that single audit requirement to you. And then you need to make a management decision based on what the single audit requirement found. For example, if the audit shows that there's some risk or that they're not properly managing it in another award, then your management needs to make decisions on if you continue to give funds to them, if you put parameters on that, or what the next steps are going to be, because you have to be a good steward of dollars. And if something shows that they are risk elsewhere, even if they're making good progress with you, you still need to take into account if they're going to be a risk, and if they are, you need to decide what parameters you will be willing to do in order to properly manage the grant dollars, so that then you are not at risk for having an audit finding from the federal agency. Okay, so you've seen the overall federal requirements that's required with federal grants. There are also Nevada requirements. There's an internal controls self-assessment checklist. This is from the Governor's Finance Office. That the checklist has to be done every 2 years. It should be done annually, but it needs to be submitted every 2 years. And there's a section on grants, and an agency has to have a policy and be able to answer yes to every single question on the self-assessment checklist. There also is a work program in the Interim Finance Committee. You are responsible to get spending authority for a grant. So even if you win award from the federal agency, you then, to operate in Nevada, have to fill out a work program and get permission and authority to spend those grant dollars, and that goes through the work program and IFC process. You need to make sure that you're following purchasing requirements. So again, if you have a vendor, you need to make sure that even if it's named and approved in the federal grant application, that you go through the purchasing requirements and the Nevada grant policy. You need to make sure that you're following all of those. The table over here can show all requirements in the State Administrative Manual and NRS, and our office is happy to answer any. We've gone over at a high level that there are requirements on how to be a good steward of grant dollars. So why is this important, and what does this mean for you? So let's look at an example. So why do you have to follow regulations, and what happens when you don't? So as I'm going through this example, I want you to think about what are some potential issues that could happen and what best practices and policies weren't followed. So think about reasonable and necessary, allocable, consistent and conformance, and documented as you're reading these. And these are real examples. A lot of what I've shared earlier sounds like common sense, but from what our office has seen and what other people have seen is it doesn't always happen. So while it may sound like common sense, there are very real examples, a lot of multiple examples of things going wrong and consequences. Okay, so county government received a large federal grant to provide social services to low-income families and children. As part of the county program, staff would implement a back-to-school drive for families and hand out items needed in the same target community, such as backpacks. Shortly after the event, county staff received a site visit from the federal program officer. The site visit review of documents revealed that some individuals receiving back-to-school materials were in fact not from the neighborhood, and they were not a part of a low-income household. Okay, so they were giving items to people who weren't eligible for them. What are some potential issues that could happen, and what best practices and policies weren't followed? So the consequence of this real-life example is the county government had to give back a portion of the funding used to cover the back-to-school program. So they had to come out with dollars out of their own pockets to rectify the situation. So what are potential issues that could happen So additionally, other than giving back a portion of the funds and finding that from somewhere, they could have been found to be non-compliant. They could have had to potentially give back the entire grant portion if they weren't following procedures. They could have given back the whole thing. If they really push it, they could have been debarred or suspended for misuse of funds. And when you're put on this suspension and debarment list, it means that you are not eligible to receive any federal funding. And so it could have some very serious economic impacts on this organization, and therefore the other organizations, if money needed to be paid back, is taken from like a general fund. So what best practices that weren't followed is they didn't have proper internal controls. They needed to have a policy on how to identify the low-income populations, and they needed to have a procedure on how they're going to properly delegate these backpacks. So how would you fix the situation? If you could go back, there are a couple of options. The first that they could do is they could partner with an organization who serves only low-income participants. So for example, if they partnered with Head Start, who receives their funding based on requirements of income. So you could partner with somebody and subgrant to them to have them give out the backpacks when they're already checking and they already know that their populations and those who are receiving services qualify for the low income. You could also, if you wanted to administer it yourself, is you could identify from the U.S. Census tracts low income zip codes, and you could find high poverty zip codes. And then when the participants or those who were seeking to benefit from this program came in, you could check their license or some kind of ID and make sure that they have the zip code that is in the high poverty area that it checks out. So there are a couple options. You could partner with somebody who does this already, or if you wanted to do it yourself, you could come up with a procedure and use information and data on how to properly check to make sure that those who are taking are properly documented. And again, the county might have been giving out families who were in the low income areas, but since they weren't capturing this properly, they were penalized for that. And so that's why you need to document and to cover yourself that what you're doing is in line with what you said you were going to do. Okay, example number 2. So as I read these, I want you to think about potential issues that could happen and what best practices and policies weren't followed. Okay, a county government had an annual performance contract with a federal agency. The county was awarded supplemental grant funds from the same federal agency to enhance their program for providing staff training. The grant funds had a 12-month project period. Over a 7-month period, county staff failed to meet several deliverables on their annual contract. For example, staff were responsible for closing 10+ cases a month with low-income program participants. During the past year, staff had only closed 6 cases due to the retirement of 1 staff member, and another staff member took an extended medical leave. After a desk audit, the federal agency temporarily suspended the program, offered technical assistance, and suggested a corrective action plan to mitigate program closure. However, the county did not implement any of these suggested actions. So what are potential issues and what practices and policies weren't followed? Okay, so if you look at this, this is a programmatic issue. I said that there can be fiscal or program findings, and this one was because they were not meeting their program deliverables. So then if you notice in the last paragraph, the federal agency temporarily suspended the program and they offered them technical assistance. So the feds have come in and looked at them and they offered a suggested corrective action plan to which the agency agreed. And so after that corrective action plan, they still didn't meet the requirements. So the consequence of this was the funder suspended the annual contract due to lack of performance, and they rescinded the second grant until further notice. So this could potentially be very impactful in a negative way on this organization. They're not eligible immediately for the second grant, and they're not getting paid for the first contract that they have. So some things that could have been done better is the first thing that they did was they did not notify the federal project officer of key staff changes. And so when that happens, if you're having key staff turnover, you need to let the federal project officer know. In my experience, the federal project officers have been really willing to help and offer guidance where they can. And I've seen them as a partner, and you know, they want to see success in the grant, and of course it's up to you as the awardee to meet the outcomes and to be sure that you're working towards those. But it's also important that you see the federal project officer as a partner and to keep them posted on important things like key personnel, so then maybe they can offer guidance or some kind of support. And again, you know, it's up to you as the awardee to meet the requirements, but do keep the federal project officer informed. Another thing that they could have done is, it sounds like the corrective action plan was something that they weren't able to meet. And so when you are signing a corrective action plan, and hopefully you won't ever have to, but if you do, it's a good faith effort between both parties to try and get the grant back on track. So when you are signing the plan, you need to be sure that it's something that you can do. And if it's not, you need to say so and then work it out with your project officer. And this is important to note that, you know, in the previous example, it was some fiscal examples that they kind of got hung up on, but this is a programmatic component. And so they will look for, you need to be meeting your requirements on both the programmatic side and on the fiscal side. If you're not meeting your deliverables programmatically, you can be in just as much risk and trouble as if it was fiscal as well. Okay, and so this is an example of a Nevada situation. So review the email below and identify potential ramifications this will have for Nevada. So you see this email is what came out from my supervisor at the grant office, discussing that there was an audit by the Office of the Inspector General the year before last. And so the agency who received the findings has been working hard on the corrective action plan, and that's from the example we saw last time. They're put on a corrective action plan. But the findings were then found in the entire state of Nevada's single audit report as an adverse opinion. So it showed up on the entire state of Nevada report. So what we have seen from this is it's come to the attention that the federal agency, the U.S. Department of Justice, has been placing special conditions on all Department of Justice awards to the Nevada state agencies due to the designation of DHHS as a high-risk entity. So this means that the agency was, if any applicant applies from the state of Nevada, there is a high-risk designation. Because just because the one agency had the audit findings, the entire state is now designated as high risk. And so potential ramifications for this means that some applicants might not be awarded, even if they weren't the ones with the findings. Some of the federal agencies may not want to award because they see it as too much as a risk, even if it's not the one who's found to be with the findings.
they can still not award. They can also not award, or they can place special conditions on awards, whether it's the agency who received the findings or an agency who did not receive the findings, which means they can withhold payments until the deficiencies are corrected. They can disallow all or part of the cost of the activities not in compliance. They can wholly suspend or terminate the federal awards. They can initiate or suspend debarment proceedings. They can withhold further federal funds, or they can not expend certain things. So this has pretty big implications for the entire state. So just one agency can affect many others, and so that's why being vigilant in your monitoring and expenditures is really important. Okay, so what's happened with example 3 is the agency is under a corrective action plan. They are working diligently to correct findings. They attend regular meetings with the auditor, and any agency from Nevada who applies is labeled high risk. So in addition to the consequences of what I shared in the last slide, now program staff is spending a lot of their time attending monthly meetings, working to correct findings, and so in addition to their full-time jobs, they are now needing to fix what has happened, and so it just takes a lot of time in addition to being seen as a risk and putting future funding opportunities at risk. And again, the future funding opportunities mean services to Nevadans. So it's not just that they have to spend a lot of their time trying to fix what has happened, but that could be services lost to people. Okay, so now let's look at a scenario. And what would you do? So your state agency has a grant of $10 million to assist with expanding access to voting. It is a 5-year grant. During a self-assessment in year 4, an agency discovers that as part of the grant award, the funds were to be kept in an interest-bearing account, and the accrual of interest was to be used as part of the project costs. Okay, so since there was no interest accrued, your agency has lost over $2 million that must be used to fulfill their program requirements. So in Nevada, what does this mean? What are some scenarios that could happen, and how will you finish the program? How would you get the $2 million? And what resources could have been affected to finish the project that had nothing to do with the program? How did this program become a problem for the state and affect Nevadans? Okay, so what this means is, as part of the total grant award, the original $10 million was supposed to be put in an interest-bearing account, and then for the last year, that money that would have been accrued in the interest was going to project costs. So you are $2 million short to meet the deliverables of the program. What are some scenarios that could happen? Is you could try and find the $2 million. How you would find that would be hard. You could not meet the federal requirements and not meet your program deliverables and be forced to give some or all of the money back because you did not meet the program requirements. So you'd have to give $10 million back or part of. And you could potentially be disbarred or flagged as high risk and not receive future funding opportunities. You can try and find somebody who would come up either privately or through other avenues to come up with the $2 million. Or if you're in Nevada, you could go to the IFC and take money from the contingency fund. which would mean that you would have to go before the Board of Examiners and explain what had happened, and go before the legislatures and explain what happened. You could do that and then meet the grant requirements, but it would cost quite a bit of time and explaining to do. So this is why it's pivotal that you read from the very beginning the requirements of your grant that you set up, and I would have a pre-meeting before you go on with all of the stakeholders. You would create a plan of how you're going to be delivering these year to year, and that all requirements are met. So it's very important that you are knowing what you're doing from the beginning, asking questions if you don't know, and that you're meeting these, because all of these previous examples that I've given are real life scenarios and they actually happened. Again, while it may sound like common sense, these things have happened and they happen regularly. So always think reasonable and necessary, allocable, conformance and consistent, and documented. And be sure that you read, and read again your grant requirements. Okay, so to recap, if you have a grant, you are responsible for having policies and following regulations and best practices. There will be some resources where to find these following. Good stewardship of grant dollars impacts Nevadans and communities. Remember that these are services that are given to people, and misappropriation can mean lost opioid treatment, lost preschool opportunities, being able to take from the contingency fund, and failure to adhere to these can cost citizens immediately and in the future. Immediately, and if you need to give back federal grant dollars, or in the future if we're missing opportunities because the federal agencies won't fund us because of past mistakes. Okay, and some resources on where you can find further information. Grants.gov, they have YouTube tutorials on how to operate their websites, their workspace. They have a blog on best practices, how to write good applications, how to manage properly. FFIS, they have funding opportunities, and they show where money goes to in Nevada. Your federal agency newsletters, like for example, the Federal Department of Education, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Justice, they have newsletters that they will send out all the time, highlighting awarded grant programs, discussing what's important to them, discussing future funding opportunities. And these are really good to read to see what they are interested in. So when you are writing an application, you can write competitively to it. And you can also find other organizations across the country who are managing in areas that you are interested in. There's the Natural Grants Management Association. It's best practices for grant professionals. They have trainings you can buy. It's a subscription, but they offer some really good trainings and networking opportunities to discuss with other grant professionals. There's the Grant Professional Association, which does the same thing. The State Grant Work Group that the Nevada Grant Office operates, that we would be happy to have you in if you're a grant professional. There's a link to the Division of Internal Audit and the Self-Assessment Questionnaire. These are your agency needs to be making sure that you're checking yes to all the boxes. And then there's the grants.nme.gov, the State of Nevada Grant Office website that again has the Nevada Grant Manual and forms. Remember, the Grants Office is here to help. Please do not ever hesitate to contact us if you have any questions or need further information. We have access to a lot of resources, and so if you have specific topic questions, we can find you good resources on that. If you're interested in further training, we also have access to that. And then there is a grant conference likely in January of 2021 that will be for the state of Nevada and will bring together presenters, panels, and best practices. So we'll keep you informed on that as that shapes up and as we get more information. Again, here is my contact information. I'm Erin Hasty. I'm looking forward to working with you and answering any questions you may have. Thank you.